All right, hey, how's everybody doing? So we have a lecture today on economic analyses, and I'm just going to go ahead and jump into that discussion. Let me share my screen here with you all. All right, so first off, again, as always, I hope everybody is staying relatively safe and healthy out there. The computer's being a little slow at the moment. I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy. We're going to continue to discuss policy analysis, aspects of policy analysis today. But first, I want to remind you that assignment 3 is due this Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Assignment 3 is available on Blackboard, covering some basic elements of COVID-19, the coronavirus, and really just to get you to engage with the coronavirus and how it relates to some aspects of public policy, particularly with respect to policy analysis. So what I want to do today is continue to expand our understanding of policy analysis with a discussion about different analytical methods that are involved in analyzing a particular policy or a particular policy solution to a particular public problem. And we're going to talk about, specifically, we're going to talk about economic analyses. Where we're focused at, so if you go back to the policy analysis process that's talked about in the course text and what we talked about the last couple of lectures, we discussed defining and analyzing the problem, which is what assignment 3 relates to. We lectured, or I lectured last class, about constructing policy alternatives and choosing evaluative criteria. Today we're going to talk about actual assessment of policy options using evaluative criteria. And so with that, I mentioned last couple lectures that there's kind of 4 important criteria that are often used to think about potential solutions to any given problem in public policy. One is efficiency, right? The benefits versus the costs of certain policy options that you have. The other is effectiveness, the likelihood of achieving a desired goal or objective using a particular policy tool or instrument, the ethics of a particular policy tool that's applied to address a problem, right? Thinking about issues of equity, the distribution of the benefits and costs of that particular instrument relative to other policy approaches. And then, of course, we can think about the political feasibility, right? So how likely is it that we actually get this policy passed through and legitimize it through the policymaking process? So in general, analytical methods can be grouped into 3 categories. The first is economic approaches. The second and third are political and institutional types of analyses, and we'll talk about those next class. But we're going to focus in on economic approaches. And specifically, we're going to spend some time talking about cost-benefit analysis, which is a very, very commonly applied tool to analyze policy options for addressing a public problem. We'll briefly discuss cost-effectiveness analysis, which is closely related to cost-benefit analysis. And then we'll go over some basic elements of risk assessment. And again, today, these are really fundamental aspects of policy analysis and assessing different policy options. We're just going to give a brief introduction to these things. You can take full courses in each of these areas of analysis, and it's much more complex than what I'm going to present to you. But it's important to know that these exist, and it's important to know the basics of them and how they're applied. So when we talk about economic approaches, as I mentioned last class, we're really zeroing in on efficiency. So efficiency is kind of this cost-benefit approach to thinking about a particular policy solution to a public problem. And so, when we talk about efficiency, how much bang are we going to get for the buck, right? How much benefit are we going to get out of the policy action? How much impact is it going to have given that it costs money to implement? Economic approaches make a lot of sense to assessing the efficiency criteria that is often applied to evaluate different policy solutions. So, efficiency focuses, again, on the cost of government programs, the benefits that those programs will provide given those costs, and it helps us to think about these trade-offs from an economic perspective. And as I mentioned, this is an economic lens. We will discuss some ethical questions about using an economic lens to do policy analysis. But as I mentioned, when we talk about public policy, we're talking about expenditures of public money. And so it's really important to think about how that money is being allocated. And so a common approach is the use of cost benefit analysis, which is basically the approach that's used to weigh the advantages, the positives, or the benefits of a particular policy intervention versus the disadvantage, the cost of a policy intervention, right? Because if we implement a policy, it's going to presumably help us to work towards our goals and objectives, which is the benefit, right? But it's going to cost money to do that. Those are the costs. And so, we want to balance these things and compare, does one policy intervention give us a lot of benefits with a relatively low cost? Does it give us few benefits with a high cost? And ultimately, we want to, from an efficiency perspective, choose an instrument that is efficient, right? Gives us the most benefit at kind of the lowest relative cost to other policy options that may be usable to address a particular problem. So just as an example, again, thinking in the real world, and we're going to think about this as it applies to COVID in the next couple of weeks. But if we go back to 2005, you had Hurricane Katrina, right? In New York. In 2012, you have Hurricane Sandy. These are extreme weather events that have significant impacts to society, the economy, and so one way to think about this is, what can we do to prevent the detrimental impacts of these types of occurrences, right? So this is just one example of thinking about cost-benefit analysis, and it's presented in the text, and that's why I'm using it, so that we can kind of keep things simple. But if you look at Hurricane Katrina in 2005, you have more than 1,300 people losing their lives. Many people lost their homes, businesses, people experienced pain and trauma. You also have a lot of infrastructural damage that may limit certain services from being provided, such as, if you have highways damaged, there's less economic productivity resulting from fewer cars and transportation challenges. You have utility issues, which again can have economic impacts in terms of having functional infrastructure. Schools and all of these things, again, have social implications, but also have economic implications. They present costs to society. And as I mentioned, and we'll talk about this, that from an efficiency perspective, if we're doing like benefit cost analysis, one of the things that we have to consider in that analytical approach is, what is the value of a human life? And this is a very, touchy or complex discussion. And also there's a lot of ethical questions about putting value on a life. But from a cost benefit analysis view and from an efficiency perspective, this is something that is often done. So ultimately, Hurricane Katrina, you have more than $100 billion in costs, right? These are the estimated economic impacts of all of these different factors when we put them together from one event, Hurricane Katrina. So the question is like, what could we have done to better prepare Louisiana to, which was the most hardest hit state by this event? What could we have done to better prepare these regions to basically be resilient to these effects, right? Well, there's many different things. You could invest in infrastructure up front, right? The same thing applies to Hurricane Sandy, that, New York was hit really hard by Hurricane Sandy. There are some mitigation things that could have been put in place to prepare cities to, absorb some of these impacts, right? So that, the goal with Katrina is like, what could we have done to lose fewer lives, to had less significant impacts to infrastructure? Well, you can build higher barriers, levees. So flooding was a big problem here. That takes money, right? And so, from a cost benefit perspective, it's like, well, what would it take to have had greater protection? How much money would we have had to spend from a government perspective to ensure the protection of these assets, right? Most estimates, and again, this is something that is estimated, that the range of establishing infrastructure and emergency services that would have improved or the response and decreased the impact from the hurricane would have been maybe a few $1 billion, right? So again, cost benefit analysis allows us to think about this, right? Certainly no one wants their municipality or their state to be significantly affected by something like a hurricane. The question is, how much would we have to spend to reduce those impacts? And if you look at the estimates, $100 billion of damages versus if we would have invested a few $1 billion up front, right? There's significant advantages or benefits to taking action, and this is where cost benefit analysis can be an effective approach. You know, again, you can think of a lot of different policy areas where cost benefit analysis can be applied. In recent years, there's been discussion about building a high-speed rail. This was estimated to cost about $8 billion in 2012, 53 billion over 6 years, right? So you're looking at maybe $60 billion of investment to build a high-speed rail. That's a cost, right? That's a cost that government would have to invest in building some infrastructure to develop this high-speed rail that allows for relatively rapid transit between regions via rail, right? If we're talking about the construction of a wall, right, between the U.S. and Mexico, which has been which was brought up and has continued to be discussed by the Trump administration and actually implemented, that it would cost about 1.6 billion of upfront investment in 2018 and 21.6 billion to complete, right? So these are costs. The question becomes, what are the benefits, right? What are the benefits of having a high-speed rail to the U.S.? What are the benefits to the U.S. of investing in building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico? And again, in order to justify investing the money, we have to think about these things. Okay, it's going to cost this much. What benefits is it going to provide? And what's the value of those benefits relative to the costs? Ultimately, we want to know, again, to justify a project, you have to say, well, the societal benefits will be greater than the costs, right? From a more complicated perspective, or to add some complexity there, you would want to compare alternative approaches to providing the same outcomes, right? So if the wall is designed to reduce illegal immigration, what else could we do to reduce illegal immigration, right? There's other policy solutions to this process, perhaps, and we'd have to think about the costs of those solutions versus the benefits that they might provide, and compare that to the cost and the benefits of the wall example, right? And ultimately, it's important because if we're not prudent, again, from a public policy perspective with how public money is being spent, this can really come back to political backlash in terms of how public money is being allocated. And so again, if the costs significantly or in general outweigh the benefits of a particular policy approach, then we might argue that it's not in the public's interests, right? And so again, this is where cost-benefit analysis, thinking about efficiency, is a valuable assessment tool to provide some transparency and information about particular policy interventions. And in the real world, you know, as I've already kind of mentioned, this is applied. For example, if you can go to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's website, and they do what are called regulatory impact analyses. So what these are is essentially it's a benefit cost or cost benefit analysis, and these formal evaluations are triggered for regulations, environmental regulations that are expected to cost at least $100 million, right? So they're proposing a new law, a new rule that the Environmental Protection Agency is going to enforce or implement. And if the projected cost of that enforcement to society, the economy, to businesses, something like this, is overall at the national level at least $100 million or greater, then the EPA has to do a regulatory impact analysis. And again, this gets back to saying, okay, we're going to regulate this particular industry. It's going to cost over $100 million. But here's the benefits, right? The benefits are this much money. And so this, again, is a tool to support transparent policy actions, in this case in the implementation of policy, to create some transparency and basically justification for using a particular policy intervention to address a particular public problem. Again, cost-benefit analysis is a complicated endeavor. You can take a whole course on cost-benefit analysis, particularly if you're an economist. This is relevant to you. Certainly, if you're engaged in public policy or pursuing an advanced degree in public policy, you would be exposed to cost-benefit analysis as a tool. But we're just going to touch over the key areas. So, in doing cost-benefit analysis, there's kind of 4 essential steps. One is identifying the critical or the important long-term and short-term costs and benefits, right? What's it going to cost up front? What do we think it's going to cost every year to implement this program into the future? What are the benefits? What are the immediate benefits we're going to see? What are the benefits into the future? So we have to think about these things in the long term as well as the short term. Once we've identified those costs and benefits, we then have to figure out ways to measure them in monetary terms, because remember, this is an economic analytical tool. And so we have to use the common unit of analysis is monetary value, right? So in the US, it would be the dollar, right? Once we've kind of figured out how to measure some things in terms of their monetary value, the costs and the benefits, we have to think about what are we having trouble measuring, right? So if there's some type of intangible or qualitative benefit or cost, we have to think about how do we measure those things, right? So let's say improved environmental quality is some benefit of a new environmental regulation. Well, we might know that improving environmental quality can have human health benefits, right? And maybe we can estimate those benefits in terms of fewer visits to hospitals, fewer premature illnesses or deaths, and we might be able to figure out a value on those things, right? Fewer hospital visits, well, people are spending less money to go to the hospital. But what if one of the benefits is protection of wildlife, right? We've protected this particular species of animal from becoming endangered or becoming more endangered. What is the value of that, right? And so we have to come up with innovative ways to estimate the value of things that often don't have market value, right? That are difficult to monetize because they're not regularly monetized. And so that's a complicated, and again, in a more advanced course, you would get into some details on this, but for our class, you need to understand that not everything is monetizable, right? We can't put a dollar value on everything. But from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, that ultimately is the goal, right? And once you've come up with kind of the estimates of the long, short-term costs and benefits, you've monetized everything, then you want to determine, how do they weigh up with one another? So what you do is basically, from a cost-benefit perspective, you determine the net benefits, which is just taking all of the benefits, adding them up in terms of dollar value, and subtracting from that all of the costs, right? This gives you the net benefit. And again, from a rational policy making perspective, you would want that net benefit value to be as large as possible, right? You want the biggest difference between the benefits and the costs of policy action. If you had 2 different policy tools you were looking at, where one had really large net benefit and the other one had a really small net benefit, but maybe they both have the same level of effectiveness, you would pick the one with the larger net benefit, right? And again, that's the goal, or basically the objective in cost-benefit analysis, is to determine these net benefits. You can also make comparisons using what's called the ratio of benefit, using a ratio, the ratio of benefits to costs, where essentially, again, you're just taking all of the benefits and dividing them, in this case, by all of the costs. And so in this case, you would want, again, the ultimate ratio, the quotient of that process to be large as possible relative to the other options. And so again, this is just a simple overview of cost-benefit analysis, estimating short and long-term benefits and costs, monetizing those benefits and costs, figuring out a way to monetize things that don't have market value, and then determining the net benefits and costs of a particular policy intervention, right? I don't know why I put that there, but it's there. So given that, again, there are some things that can't be estimated using simple market rates, right? So what I mean there is that for some things, there's obvious costs, obvious loss of money. Maybe if there's job losses, right, lost wages, we can determine those costs for the most part. Lost wages, lost productivity. Um, but for other things, non-market things like the environmental example I gave, it's much more complicated. And so it's important to recognize that measuring in monetary terms is, for some costs and benefits, easier than others, right? Um, Oftentimes, costs are more identifiable and measurable, right? Because again, these are things that we tend to see in the relatively short to medium term. So we can identify them and track them and measure them: loss of jobs, lost wages, lost productivity, um, lost lives, hospital visits, right? Benefits can be less certain, and maybe only experienced in the longer term, right? And so not only do you run into challenges of like estimating things that don't have market value, but when you first implement a policy, some things can take a long time to see actual benefits, right? Maybe even just 5 years is relatively short, but in the terms of public policy can be a long period of time. And so, again, if we talk about addressing like the issue of climate change, which requires significantly reducing emissions, if we reduced emissions immediately, right, you would see some relatively short-term economic impacts that are quantifiable, right? But the benefit of addressing climate change, which is a long-term issue, we might not really experience the full extent of those benefits for maybe 100 years from now, right? And so it's very difficult to come up with a really accurate value for benefits in some cases, right? Um, there's also this issue of opportunity cost, and I talked about this last lecture, but opportunity cost is really just thinking about the value of opportunities that you pass up when you commit to a particular thing, right? So when you sit in traffic, for example, to get to work, um, or maybe not go to work, but when you sit in traffic, that's a lost cost, right? That's a cost of your time, and maybe the opportunity cost is like you could have been doing something more fun. If you're a cat, you don't enjoy sitting in traffic, but maybe you enjoy chasing a laser or napping, right? And so, and I mentioned this last class, that the easiest way to think about opportunity costs from a personal perspective is just think about that time or those times when you have two options to go do something that seem like they're going to be fun up front, right? And you have these two options, you choose to do one of them and you go do that. The other one you don't do, right? And maybe you go to do this thing that you chose to do that seemed like it was going to be fun. You spend the day, you go out, and it turns out to be a train wreck and you really don't have a good time. Well, that's the opportunity cost, right? Like the opportunity to go do option A and not do option B. When you get back home, you think, well, maybe I should have invested my time and my money and my efforts in doing option B, right? This is the same thing that policymakers think about when we discuss the efficiency of a particular policy option, right? Why should we invest time, resources in one policy option versus another? Well, cost benefit analysis is used to kind of make those determinations. Another example is like through regulation, right? If we regulate, let's say there's a particular industry that's particularly pollutes a lot, right? And we want to regulate that industry to reduce pollution and improve the quality of life for people that live in close proximity to that particular, let's say, industrial facility. Um, well, by regulating the company in the particular way that we choose to do, let's say we shut down the facility, right? There's some costs there. Not only the cost of enforcing the shutdown, but also loss of jobs, right? There are benefits to shutting down the facility because maybe the local quality of the environment improves and the people that live in that area benefit from that, right? So you have the cost, you have the benefits. The question is, if we shut down that facility, what could we have done with that money other than shut them down, right? Could we have had them invest in some additional research to improve the technology that's used in the facility, to lower the levels of pollution that are emitted? There's a number of different policy approaches to addressing problems caused by different things. And we really want to make sure perhaps that we're addressing those things in an efficient way. Again, minimizing that opportunity cost, because we then want to invest in policy interventions that could have been, that ended up being more costly than they could have been if we did another, if we chose another policy tool, right? And that's really the crux or the goal of cost benefit analysis. And so I want to get into one of the major issues of cost benefit analysis, which is essentially estimating values that don't have a price tag on them up front, right? The things that are difficult to quantify in terms of their costs. And so how do we do that? Well, there's a number of different ways. And again, if you were to take like an environmental economics class or any, I'm familiar with environmental economics, but if you were to take a class in cost benefit analysis, you would cover a number of different ways to determine kind of these non-market value challenges and integrate them into cost benefit analysis. But we're going to talk about one, which is very common, which is called contingent valuation. Okay, and this is an analytical approach that's used to estimate the values of things that are difficult to quantify from a monetary perspective, right? And the most common approach for contingent valuation is to use surveys, right? Questionnaires to determine an individual's, you or I, a willingness to pay or willingness to accept payment to address a particular problem, right? And I'll give an example of this in a second that was used in the beginning stages of how that made contingent valuation kind of a commonly applied approach to in public policy, right? So basically it's called contingent valuation because you're asking people how much they benefit something, and their responses to those questions are contingent on the hypothetical scenario that's presented in the survey, right? So, what I mean by that is that, we all have value, we place value on certain things, and really our responses to how much we value something are contingent on, what's being presented to us. You can present questions to people in a lot of different ways. And so it's called contingent valuation because people's responses are contingent on the questions that are asked and how they're presented. And this gets into a whole nother challenge, and there's a lot of uncertainty and ways to try to address the effect of that uncertainty. But designing the survey to support a contingent valuation approach is very complex because you really want to ask people questions about how much they value something in a way that produces credible results, right? You don't want to lead people with questions to inflate the value of something or deflate the value of something. And so again, it's called contingent valuation because people's responses are contingent on the questions they're being introduced to, which makes it really important that the surveys that are used to determine value of something that doesn't have market value are carefully designed, right? When did contingent valuation become really common in public policy questions? Well, it's been around for a long time, but one of the things that kind of raised a lot of attention for the policy world, particularly with respect to environmental and natural resources, was this massive oil spill that happened in Prince William Sound up in Alaska in the late 1980s, right? So there was basically an oil tanker traveling in Prince William Sound up in Alaska, which is a significant oil producer historically, right? So this tanker was carrying oil in it and it crashed, right? And so a lot of oil was spilled into this pristine wilderness in Alaska. The challenge is that, this is a pristine area. There's a picture there. There's not a lot of development. There's not a lot of urban areas. There's not a whole lot of people, right? This is wilderness. And so it's difficult to determine the cost of this oil spill, right? Because, you would imagine, and we've had oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, near Louisiana. When we have oil spills in places where there's industry, like in Louisiana, you have shrimping, fishing, right? These are actual commercial industries that produce a lot of revenue. If you have an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, it shuts down a shrimping industry. We can quantify those costs, right? How much revenue was lost, right? This is how we quantify that. In this case, in Prince William Sound, where there's not a lot of people, and there's not kind of this direct market way to determine the cost of this oil spill, it becomes really challenging to determine, what should be the liability for the Exxon Valdez, right, that spilt this oil. How much does it cost to repair these losses? What's the value of these losses? How much should the oil company be held responsible for, right? So contingent valuation was applied to determine this, right? Because again, this is a wilderness place. Not a lot of people live there. I've never been to Alaska, but not a lot of people live there. Not a lot of people necessarily go there. But the idea here is that that wilderness has value, even though it has non-market, even though it's not market value, right? There's no revenue being produced from it, perhaps, maybe some from tourism, but there's no industries that are reliant on the quality of this area being pristine, other than that people place value on knowing that things like this exist, right? And so the idea here is that, yes, there is value in this wilderness and we can determine it. And so what was done was there was a survey that was conducted to a sample of American households, so the whole country. And they asked, basically they were asking, how much do you value knowing that Prince William Sound, this pristine Alaskan wilderness, exists, right? What's the value of keeping it there, right? And this is a difficult question. And again, these surveys are designed in complex ways, but that's the ultimate question they were trying to get at, is how much do people value this pristine wilderness? And so how can we put a dollar value on it, right? And ultimately, this contingent valuation approach determined that people would be willing to pay, right, uh, to prevent oil to prevent oil pollution from entering this area, that they would be collectively willing to pay about $2.8 billion, right? So again, basically they're saying American households value Prince William Sound, and they're willing to pay money to make sure that it's protected. And this is about how much they're willing to pay collectively, right? Ultimately, Exxon, the company that was held liable for the spill, settled in court for $1 billion in damage, and they spent about $2.2 billion on cleanup, right? So they spent about $3.2 billion overall. And so these numbers come relatively close to one another, right? But again, this is just to show that in cost-benefit analysis, we want to determine what are the costs of things, what are the benefits of things, and sometimes those costs and benefits are really difficult to determine. Ultimately, this application of contingent valuation led to a carve out in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 that said that when you have natural resources damaged by oil pollution, there needs to be an assessment done to measure the impacts in terms of the ecological effects, the number of fish killed, the number of acres or wetlands that are destroyed. And this assessment of those impacts has to include some type of monetary determination, right? So you're integrating kind of cost-benefit analysis and perhaps the use of contingent valuation in the absence of direct market comparisons into determining the effects of like oil pollution, right? And so, this is stuff that's commonly used and is institutionalized in public policy in different areas. The next thing I want to touch on with cost-benefit analysis and this issue of valuation is the value of a life, right? Because this is a very complex thing. It's very controversial. There's a lot of ethical questions about putting dollar value on life, but it is done, and there's a number of different approaches or ways to do it. One way is through what are called wage risk analysis. So essentially what this is it's an analytical approach designed to determine the value of a life, all right? And again, I'm not advocating for this. There's many different reasons why we might not want to do this, and I'll discuss that in a second. But again, if we're applying this economic lens to look at the efficiency of policies, policy interventions, policy outcomes, impacts of behavior, integrating human lives into this equation is important. And because we're using an economic lens, putting monetary value on human life is pretty much necessary, right? So wage risk studies, essentially what they do is they look at the premium that an individual is paid for doing a particular job and compare that to other individuals who have the same, education, background, training, and look at how much more does that individual get paid relative to people who have less risky jobs, right? So for example, if we look at police officers, and this is not, this is pulled out of an old example that I previously used in other courses, but if you look at some, so I'm not saying that these statistics are accurate, it's just an example. But if you look at the number of police officers killed on the job, let's say that it's 1 in 10,000, okay? That's kind of the risk, right? 1 in 10,000 people in this line of employment will lose their life. Then we look at how much do police officers get paid relative to other people who basically have the same kind of levels of expertise and training, the same years of education, for example. How much does a police officer get paid relative to someone who's just like them in a sense, in terms of education, training, background? How much more do police officers get paid, right? And so let's say they get paid on average $700 more a year, and we call this the wage premium. So how wage risk determines the value of a life, and again, this is much more complex than what I'm presenting, but essentially you take that wage premium, the $700 a year, and if you say, okay, 1 in every 10,000 people who are police officers are going to lose their life, so you take that value of 10,000, that's like the risk, out of 10,000, 1 is going to die, okay? And you multiply that by that wage premium, it gives you the value of a life of about $7 million, okay? And that's basically a way that economists use one approach, wage risk studies, to determine the value of the human life. Now, what are some potential issues with this approach, right? Well, one is, do workers know the risk that they're taking on, right? We can think of situations where many people take on risky jobs and they're not necessarily paid a wage premium, right? And this is particularly germane to the current shelter in place, right? Where we have a lot of what we call essential workers. How much are these essential workers getting paid? Presumably, many of them are taking significant risks if they have pre-existing conditions that make them more vulnerable to the coronavirus. But if we base the value of a human life on their income and the risks that they're taking to be exposed to coronavirus, right, we might get a lower value than is actually true, because individuals that are in these risky positions currently as essential workers might not have the option to not, continue to make income, right? So do workers know the risk that they're taking, or are they kind of, in some sense, getting down to the third bullet point, is the risk involuntary, right? Are people taking risky careers or jobs because it's the only option they have? This might, again, deflate or reduce the value of a human life in using this wage risk analysis approach. The question is, do risky people choose riskier jobs, right? So that, if you tell someone, well, this is the probability that you will have a fatal accident in this particular career, there's some people that, it registers with them, wow, this is a risky job, but they might be just more risky in general. And so they might be willing to do that job without the premium. Or, whereas somebody might say, well, you need to pay me $1,000 a year more, right? Before taking that job makes sense to them. Some people might be willing to take a much lower premium to take that risky job. And so again, this can essentially deflate the actual value of a human life using this approach. The other question that's really important here is all human life valued the same? Right? So if we're looking at police officers in the US, and let's say these are the actual numbers, so the value of a life in the US is $7 million using wage risk studies and using police risks on the job and their premium to determine the value of the life, right? But let's say we look somewhere else, in some other country, right? And maybe the wages are a lot lower and maybe the risks are a lot higher, right? Or the same, right? We have to think about these things. Let's just say, for the sake of example, that the risk is the same, 1 in 10,000, but the wage is a lot lower. So now, instead of 700 times 10,000, you're multiplying 500, because maybe they only get paid 500 more a year, right? Or even less. Then you would come up with the value of a life in another country, where maybe in this case, police officers have the same risk, but they're paid a lower wage premium. Based on this estimate, you would come up with, well, in the US, the value of a human life is $7 million. In another country, the value is $5 million, right? So this raises important ethical questions. Like if we apply this approach, thinking about in like India, Bangladesh, for example, you might come up with a value of human life as $150,000 based on the wages that are being paid relative to the risks. And so what you're saying, basically using this approach, is like the value of a human life in Bangladesh is less than the value of human life in the US. And is this actually true, right? This raises a lot of important ethical questions about this approach, which is a really strong weakness of this approach. But as I said, I mean, this is just one lens that is used to analyze, policy options, impacts, etc. And if you look at the US EPA, the US EPA's kind of standard measure of the value of a human life is actually about $7.4 million dollars per life, right? That is lost or saved from a particular regulatory intervention. And so again, this is an actual thing that's done in practice, for better or for worse, but arguably it's not the only lens that we should use, right? Because it does have flaws, but it does provide some insight and perhaps an important dimension of policy discussions, right? So that's what I want to say about cost-benefit analysis. Again, we could say much, much, much more, but that's the basics that I want you to kind of be exposed to at this point. The relative of cost-benefit analysis is just cost-effectiveness analysis. And basically, this approach essentially gets rid of the benefit side and just compares different policy alternatives in terms of their relative costs. In some ways, this gets around the challenge of measuring intangible or long-term benefits that have challenges being estimated monetarily. You're kind of removing that from the equation and only relying on analysis of the costs. The primary question here, again, is thinking about choosing the lowest cost option to achieve the desired outcome. Right? So you're only focusing on costs, and you're choosing policy. If you were to only use cost effectiveness analysis to choose a policy tool, you're essentially choosing the tool that will get the desired outcome at the lowest possible cost, right? And so that's really all I want to say there. But again, the crux of cost benefit analysis and cost effectiveness analysis is getting that desired outcome at the lowest possible cost. And largely because we're talking about public policy, we're talking about spending public money, and it's important that policymakers perhaps be prudent with how that money is spent. And so cost benefit analysis provides that important angle. The second kind of strain of analyses that I want to talk about is risk assessment. All right, so this is different from, it's kind of an economic approach, right? It's very quantitative in nature, but it's not the same as cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis, right? So risk assessment essentially is designed to determine how to regulate risks, right? And when I say risk, what I'm essentially talking about here is, the magnitude or the effect, the scale of the effect of some particular event that has negative impacts or will expose people to a particular situation that's considered to be bad, right? So we talk about things like nuclear waste, this byproduct of producing nuclear energy. Where do we store it, right? That's a discussion that's oftentimes gets back to risk because it's highly radioactive. If you have a nuclear waste spill or people are exposed to nuclear waste, they're going to contract illnesses. And so where we put this stuff, if you put it in places where there's a lot of earthquakes or potential exposure to humans, it's a risky thing. And so risk analysis is important here. And again, the main purpose is to identify risks, estimate the potential risk, the magnitude of that risk, and evaluate the extent or the magnitude of the risk that particular thing poses to citizens. And so, again, nuclear waste is risky. Traffic accidents are risky for people, pedestrians, bicyclists, right? We do things every day that are considered risky, right? And we might not even know it. The question is where should the government allocate their resources given the different risks that the public are exposed to, right? Because as we've talked about in earlier classes, that policymakers are challenged with prioritizing a lot of different areas, and there's many different things a policymaker can address, they have to choose ways to prioritize their actions. And what gets to the top of a policymaker's agenda is contingent on a lot of things, right? So while there's a lot of risky things that the public is exposed to on a daily basis that can be reduced through public policy, right? Like traffic accident deaths between vehicles can be reduced by wearing a seatbelt, right? Not using cell phones, establishing bike lanes, right? Um, there's a lot of different activities that people are exposed to risks by doing or participating in. The important question for policymakers is which ones pose the greatest risk, because we want to regulate those first or perhaps most heavily. And so risk is an important conversation in public policy. What's the important aspect of identifying risks? Well, again, as I already mentioned, of course, having fewer exposures to risky events is beneficial to the public. And again, different risks vary significantly in their magnitude. You know, a lot of times, and I like to surf and go in the ocean in general, and some of you might enjoy going to the ocean. And I find that no matter how long I've been going in the ocean for recreation, it always pops into my head, you know, like, what if I get attacked by a shark, right? And this is an example of risk. And again, you know, the more significant a risk, the government is more likely to enforce or regulate behaviors to reduce the likelihood of that negative event happening, right? It's important to remember that a lot of times people worry a great deal about things that they understand the least well. So like going in the ocean, the likelihood of being attacked by a shark, right? What's the probability that that's going to happen to me, right? So even though like we might think something is terrible or dramatic is going to happen to us, sometimes we don't think about that rationally, right? What's the likelihood that I am attacked by a shark, right? What's the likelihood that I'm in a vehicular accident? That's probably greater than me being attacked by a shark, and yet I get in cars or ride a motorcycle and do that very frequently, right? And so this is where the government steps in to think about, you know, what risks are the most important to be dealt with, and they try to analyze this from a rational perspective. And despite, you know, we might think, well, we need to regulate shark attacks, the likelihood of shark attacks, right? People who analyze risk assessment are going to look at, well, what's the relative expectancy of that risk happening versus some other negative effect that has more detrimental impacts to the public, right? And this is how policymakers prioritize their behavior, right? Vaccines, this comes up. You know, many people worry about the negative impacts from vaccines. Measles vaccines has popped up a lot in terms of, you know, should people be required to vaccinate? Many people feel that they shouldn't be required because vaccination poses particular risks. The thing is, science doesn't support this, right? And so the government has generally required children to receive certain vaccines by a certain age in order to attend public schools and things like this, because there's more, perhaps greater risk of having a child who's not vaccinated being exposed to measles, and the health impacts of that are perhaps greater, and the risk is greater than being harmed by a vaccine itself, right? And so policymakers have to take these things into consideration, have to look into science, right? So this is very interdisciplinary to determine, right? There's a lot of bad things that can happen out there. What's the relative risk of each one? Therefore, where should we focus our policy efforts? And how do we determine risk? Well, again, this is just a real simplification. But essentially, in determining risk, we think about the probability of something happening and the significance of those consequences, right? And so some risks might have a really low probability of happening, but if they do, the consequences are really, really, really high, right? And so, you know, one thing is if we think about, again, I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of the head that's not like controversial to talk about. I mean, but you can think of things that, hey, you know, we do this all the time. The risks are relatively low. Let's say airplanes, flying in planes, right? This is a very common practice for commuting. A lot of people commute on airplanes. A lot of people travel on airplanes. It's considered a low risk activity, right? But if there is a plane accident, if something happens in the sky, that's a really significant consequence or impact, right? That there's likely to be a lot of significant life losses that are very important. Other things might have a higher probability of happening, but if they do, there's lower consequences, right? And so, again, we want to think about these things, and in terms of, prioritizing policy actions. Policymakers tend to focus on things that generally have, higher consequences and higher probabilities of occurring. And so, again, risk evaluation, you're just determining the acceptability of a risk or decision, making some type of determination about what risks are we willing to accept. This also requires policymakers to consider. Sorry, there's like a dirt bike out there or something. This also requires policymakers to think about, given the risk of something happening, which we determine by the probability of something happening, how many plane flights does it take before we see some type of, catastrophe happen? What are the impacts of those catastrophes? Therefore, how should we regulate the airline industry, right? So we take all this information in and determine about, what level of safety do we want? And therefore, how much should we regulate a particular industry? And this gets into risk management, right? So what does the government or even a private organization do to address those risks? We do it through regulation and public policy. The idea here is that when you want higher levels of safety, lower levels of risk, that it costs more to achieve those things because you're increasing the amount of regulation that has to be implemented to make sure that industries, businesses, individuals are following those policies, right? And so this is kind of the significance of risk assessment to public policy. So that's all I want to talk about today. I kind of broke up this lecture because I didn't want to drag on too long. But next class we will talk about, we'll continue in the chapter and talk about institutional and political analysis, and we'll discuss assignment 3, which again is due Sunday by 11:59 p.m. All right, we'll talk to you soon. And feel free to email me anytime. Reach out if you want to meet individually or offline. We can do that. I'm also going to probably be maintaining virtual office hours, and I'll post more announcements about that. All right, have a good one.